The carriage had barely stopped moving when the front door of Ashcombe Hall opened and a voice cut through the cold morning air like a blade. "She is not staying in the family corridor." Elara Whitmore froze with one foot still on the carriage step. She had traveled 3 days to reach this house, carrying nothing but a single trunk and a letter from her late mother's cousin, and already she understood that she was not welcome. The man standing in the doorway was tall, dressed in black, his jaw tight with an anger that seemed to have nothing to do with her, and everything to do with the world in general. Lord Julian Ashcombe did not look at her the way a host looks at a guest. He looked at her the way a man looks at an unwanted bill. "Take her things to the East Wing," he said to the footman beside him, not once glancing toward Elara. "The rooms there are empty. She will be comfortable enough." Comfortable was not the word the housekeeper used, not out loud, but the tightening around her mouth said it plainly enough. Mrs. Pemberton, a woman with silver hair pinned severely beneath her cap, stepped forward and took Elara's trunk from the footman herself, as though she did not trust him to carry it gently. "This way, miss," she said, her voice low and steady. "Mind the second step. It has been loose since autumn, and nobody has thought to fix it." Elara followed her across the gravel drive, past the tall windows of the main house, where warm light glowed behind heavy curtains, toward a smaller door at the far end of the building. The East Wing stood apart from the rest of Ashcombe Hall, connected only by a narrow covered walkway, its stone darker, its windows fewer. "He does not mean to be cruel," Mrs. Pemberton said quietly, though her tone suggested she did not entirely believe her own words. "His lordship has had a difficult year. His father's passing left him with more debts than sense, and more suitors for his hand than patience." "I did not come here to trouble him," Elara said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "My mother wrote to her cousin, his father, before she died. She hoped there might be a place for me here. I do not need much." "No," Mrs. Pemberton agreed, glancing sideways at her. "I do not suppose you do." The East Wing smelled of dust and cold stone. Sheets covered the furniture in the corridor like pale ghosts standing guard over rooms nobody used. Mrs. Pemberton led her up a narrow staircase to a small chamber at the end of the hall, its single window overlooking an overgrown garden choked with weeds and fallen branches. "It is not much," the housekeeper admitted, setting the trunk down at the foot of the bed. "But the roof does not leak, and the fireplace draws well enough once it is cleaned. I will send someone to light it this evening." "Thank you," Elara said, and meant it. It was the first kindness offered to her since she had left her old life behind. Mrs. Pemberton lingered in the doorway a moment longer than necessary. "You will find the house is not as cold as its master, miss. Give it time." Then she was gone, her footsteps fading down the stairs, and Elara was alone in a room that had not been slept in for years, in a house that had made its opinion of her plain within the first hour of her arrival. She did not cry. She had promised herself, on the long carriage ride from the coast, that she would not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her weep, least of all a man who had not even bothered to learn her name before banishing her to the far side of his home. Instead, she opened the window, letting in the sharp autumn air, and looked down at the garden below. It was a ruin. Rose bushes had grown wild and thorny, choking the paths between them. A stone bench sat half buried beneath fallen leaves, and what might once have been a fountain stood dry and cracked in the center of it all. But beneath the neglect, Elara could see the shape of something that had once been loved. Someone had planted these roses with care. Someone had chosen this spot for the bench so that it caught the afternoon sun. She decided, in that moment, that she would not spend her days in this house waiting to be noticed by a man who clearly had no wish to notice her. She would find her own purpose here, however small. The following morning, she rose before the rest of the household and made her way down to the garden with a pair of shears she had found in an unused closet. The gravel path was slick with dew, and the cold bit at her fingers, but she did not mind. There was a strange comfort in the work, in pulling weeds and cutting back the wild growth, in uncovering, inch by inch, the bones of something beautiful beneath the neglect. She was so absorbed in her task that she did not hear the footsteps behind her until a voice spoke. "You should not be out here alone, miss. It is not safe before the frost clears." She turned to find a young man watching her from the edge of the path, a wooden bucket in his hand and mud on his boots. He looked to be no older than 16, with reddish hair and a face full of freckles, and he was staring at her the way one might stare at something unexpected. "I did not think gardens were dangerous," Elara said, brushing dirt from her hands. "It is not the garden, miss. It is his lordship. He does not like anyone touching this part of the grounds." The boy glanced nervously toward the main house, as though Julian might appear at any moment. This was her ladyship's garden, his mother's, I mean. Nobody has come near it since she passed, years back. Alara's hands stilled on the shears. I did not know. Most don't, the boy said. I am Peter, miss. I look after the horses mostly, but I do what needs doing. He hesitated, then added, You are doing it right, by the way. The pruning. My mother kept a garden like this before. There was something in the way he said it, quiet and a little sad, that told Alara he understood loss in a way that made him gentler than his years. She found herself softening toward him immediately. Would you help me then? She asked. I do not know the names of half these plants, and I suspect you do. Peter's face brightened, and for the next hour, the two of them worked side by side, clearing the path around the fountain while he told her which of the roses would bloom red and which would bloom white, and which bush his own mother had once helped plant, years before Alara had ever set foot in Ashcombe Hall. It was the first real conversation she had shared with anyone since her arrival, and it left her with a small, stubborn seed of hope. That hope did not survive the day intact. She returned to the main house near midday, drawn by hunger and the need to ask Mrs. Pemberton where she might take her meals, and found herself crossing paths with Julian in the long gallery that connected the two wings. He was reading a letter, his brow furrowed, and did not look up until she was nearly upon him. When he did look up, his eyes swept over her muddied dress and dirt-streaked hands with open disapproval. I was told you would keep to your rooms, he said. I was not told that at all, Alara replied, refusing to lower her gaze. I was told the East Wing would be my home. Nothing more. Something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps, that she had answered him at all rather than apologizing and retreating. Most people in his household did not speak to him so plainly. The garden is not to be touched, he said instead, his voice hardening. I would ask you to remember that. Why? The question left her before she could stop it. It is dying, my lord. I am only trying to save what is left of it. For a moment, something raw passed behind his eyes, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. Some things, he said quietly, are better left to die. He walked away before she could answer, his boots echoing against the stone floor, and Alara stood alone in the gallery, more certain than ever that there was a great deal of pain buried beneath Julian Ashcombe's cold exterior. She did not know yet what had put it there. She only knew, with a certainty she could not quite explain, that she was not ready to give up on the garden, or on the house that had banished her to its farthest corner. That evening, as she sat by the small fire in her chamber, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find Mrs. Pemberton holding a tray of bread, cheese, and warm soup. I thought you might not know your way to the kitchens yet, the housekeeper said, stepping inside without waiting to be invited. And I heard about the garden. Alara's stomach tightened. Is he very angry? He is always angry about something, Mrs. Pemberton said, setting the tray down on the small table by the window. But Peter tells me you have a gift for it, the garden. Said you knew exactly where to cut without killing the root. She studied Alara for a long moment. That is more than most people manage in this house, miss, knowing where to cut without killing the root. Alara was not certain if the housekeeper was still speaking of roses. I do not wish to cause trouble, she said. I only wish to feel useful. Then keep at it, Mrs. Pemberton said simply, quietly, if you must. There are more people in this house who need tending than his lordship realizes, and not all of them wear thorns on the outside. She moved toward the door, then paused. Good night, Miss Whitmore. I think you will find your place here yet. Long after the housekeeper had gone, Alara sat by the fire with the warm bowl of soup cooling untouched beside her, thinking of the wild garden below her window, of the boy who had known exactly which roses his mother had planted, and of the flash of pain she had seen in Julian Ashcombe's eyes before he had turned and walked away. She had been sent to the East Wing to be forgotten, but as the fire crackled and the wind moved through the bare branches outside, she found herself thinking that forgotten places had a way of becoming exactly where the most important things began to grow. She thought, too, of the way Mrs. Pemberton had looked at her when she spoke of thorns on the outside, as though the housekeeper knew more about the master of the house than she was willing to say. There was a story here, buried beneath the cold rules and the locked garden gate, and Alara found that she wanted very much to understand it, not out of idle curiosity, but because some quiet part of her recognized a fellow soul who had learned to protect himself by keeping everyone at a distance. She finished her soup slowly, watching the flames settle into embers, and when she finally climbed into the narrow bed in her narrow room, she found that sleep came easier than she expected. Somewhere below her window, the garden waited in the dark, patient and half-wild, as though it too understood that change was coming to Ashcombe Hall, one small kindness at a time. She did not yet know how right she was. The scream came from the stables before dawn had fully broken. Elara was already dressed, having risen early out of habit, and she was down the narrow staircase and out into the cold before she had time to think about whether it was her place to go at all. She found Peter sitting on an overturned bucket, his face white, his right hand wrapped around a rag already soaked through with blood. "I told him not to reach behind the mare," said an older groom, hovering uselessly nearby. "She bites when she is startled, that one. Always has." "Has someone sent for the physician?" Elara asked, kneeling beside the boy and gently taking his wrist. "Physician will not come out for a stable boy's hand," the groom muttered. "Not before noon, at least, and not without payment first." Elara did not waste time arguing about the unfairness of that. She had learned, from years of caring for her own ailing mother with little money and less help, that a wound left too long untreated became a far greater danger than the wound itself. She unwrapped the rag carefully. The bite had broken the skin along 2 knuckles, deep enough to worry her, though the bone did not appear damaged. "I will need clean water, a needle if you have a fine one, thread, and whatever spirits you keep for cleaning tack," she said. "And bring the lamp closer. It is too dark to see properly out here." The groom hesitated. "Beg your pardon, miss, but you are a guest of the house. This is hardly—" "He is bleeding," Elara said, her voice sharp enough to end the argument. "Bring me what I asked for." Within the hour, Peter's hand was cleaned, stitched with careful, steady fingers, and bound properly. He had gone pale twice during the stitching but had not made a sound beyond a sharp intake of breath, determined, it seemed, not to embarrass himself in front of her. "You did not have to do that," he said afterward, staring at the neat row of stitches with something like wonder. "Someone had to," Elara replied simply. "And I have done worse before, on someone I loved very much, with far less light and far less help." She did not explain further, and Peter did not ask, but something in his eyes told her he understood that her kindness came from a place of old pain, the way most true kindness does. Word of what had happened in the stables spread through the household before the midday meal was served. By the time Elara returned to the main house to see about her own breakfast, she found that the cook, a broad, warm-faced woman named Margaret, had already heard the story twice over from 2 different maids. "Stitched him up herself, did you?" Margaret said, eyeing Elara with open curiosity as she set a plate of bread and butter before her. "In the dark, with nothing but tack cleaner to clean the wound. That boy's mother would have wept with gratitude, God rest her." "I only did what needed doing," Elara said, feeling suddenly self-conscious under the older woman's gaze. Margaret did not look convinced that it was quite so simple. "Well, you will find the kitchen door is always open to you, miss, whatever his lordship says about the east wing. A person who tends to a frightened boy before she tends to her own breakfast is welcome at my table any day of the week." It was, Elara would come to realize, the way things worked in a house like Ashcombe Hall. Small kindnesses did not stay small. They traveled from the stables to the kitchen, from the kitchen to the laundry room, from the laundry room to the housekeeper's private parlor, growing a little with each retelling, until by the end of the week it seemed as though every servant in the house had heard some version of the story, and formed their own opinion of the quiet young woman who had been banished to the east wing. Elara did not seek out this attention. If anything, she found it faintly embarrassing, and she tried to deflect it whenever anyone brought it up. But she could not deny that something in the house had begun to shift. Where once the servants had passed her in the halls with polite, distant nods, they now paused to greet her by name, to ask after her comfort, to mention, almost too casually, that the east wing fireplace had been giving off smoke and really ought to be looked at properly. She continued her work in the garden each morning, and Peter, his hand healing well beneath its careful stitches, insisted on helping her whenever his duties allowed, teaching her the names of every plant that had survived years of neglect. Together they cleared the path to the old stone bench, uncovered the base of the dry fountain, and began, cautiously, to prune back the roses without cutting away the new growth trying to push through beneath the dead wood. "There," Peter said one afternoon, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. "You can see the shape of it again. The old paths. My mother used to say, 'A garden never really dies, miss. It just waits for someone patient enough to remember what it wanted to be.'" Elara thought of her own life in those words, more than she cared to admit aloud. It was Mrs. Pemberton who first noticed the change most clearly, watching from the kitchen window one gray morning, as half the household staff seemed to find some excuse to walk past the east wing garden. The scullery maid brought out water she did not need to fetch from that direction. The elderly gardener, who had given up on the roses years before, wandered down to offer gruff advice about the soil. Even the stern old butler, Edmund, paused one evening to remark that the garden was looking more like itself than it had in a decade. "You have a gift for this," Mrs. Pemberton said to Elara one night, finding her mending a torn hem by candlelight rather than paying someone else to do it, a small kindness Elara had quietly extended to one of the younger maids whose eyesight was beginning to fail. "Not just for gardens. For people. You make them feel seen." "I only notice what is already there," Elara said. "I do not do anything special." "That," Mrs. Pemberton said, "is precisely what makes it special. Most people in grand houses like this one look straight through the servants, miss. As though we were furniture that happened to speak when spoken to. You do not do that. Not once, not to anyone, and they have all noticed." Elara considered this in the quiet of her small chamber that night, the fire crackling low, the garden dark and sleeping beneath her window. She had not come to Ashcombe Hall intending to win anyone's affection. She had come because she had nowhere else to go, and because a letter written years before her mother's death had promised her a place, however small, in a house that did not particularly want her. She had expected loneliness. She had expected the cold corridors and the colder welcome to define her days here. Instead, she found herself, slowly and without quite meaning to, becoming part of the quiet, invisible web that held a great house together. The servants who scrubbed the floors and tended the horses and prepared the meals were not furniture at all. They were people with names and griefs and small joys, people who noticed when someone finally treated them as such, and who remembered it. Julian, for his part, seemed unaware of the shift happening beneath his own roof. He kept largely to his study, buried in ledgers and letters from creditors, emerging only for meals he often took alone, his mood growing shorter with each passing week as his aunt's letters arrived with increasing frequency, each one more insistent than the last about the necessity of securing his engagement to Lady Vivian Ashford before the year's end. He noticed, vaguely, that the house seemed less grim than it had in months. He noticed that Mrs. Pemberton hummed while she worked, that the cook sent up better meals than the household accounts should have allowed for, that even Edmund's stiff shoulders seemed to have relaxed by some small degree. He did not, at first, connect any of this to the quiet young woman he had banished to the East Wing on her very first day in his home. It was only when he passed the garden late one evening, taking a rare walk to clear his head after a particularly bruising letter from his aunt, that he stopped short, staring at what had once been a ruin. The paths were clear. The fountain, though still dry, had been scrubbed clean of moss and grime. The roses, pruned with a careful hand that clearly understood exactly where to cut, had begun to show the first signs of new growth despite the lateness of the season. It looked, for the first time in years, like the garden his mother had once loved so dearly that she had spent entire afternoons among its roses, humming to herself, utterly at peace in a way he had rarely seen her anywhere else. He stood there a long while in the fading light, something tightening in his chest that he did not have a name for, before turning and walking back to the house without a word to anyone. He did not mention the garden the next morning, nor the morning after that, but he began, without quite admitting it to himself, to take his walks along that particular path more often than any other, always at the hour when he was least likely to be seen watching it. A fortnight later, a letter arrived from Lady Constance that put the entire house on edge before the ink had even had time to dry on his lordship's reply. Edmund carried the news below stairs with the grave face of a man delivering word of an approaching storm. "Her ladyship arrives within the month," he announced to the assembled staff in the servants' hall, "and she does not travel alone. Lady Vivian Ashford is to accompany her." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Margaret set down her rolling pin with more force than necessary. Mrs. Pemberton's mouth thinned into a hard line. "That woman," Margaret muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear, "left the Hartley kitchen in tears the last time she visited, over nothing more than a badly folded napkin. I remember it well. Poor girl never worked in service again, so shaken was she by the scolding." "She is to be his lordship's wife, by all accounts," Edmund said, though his tone made clear he took no pleasure in reporting it. "Lady Constance has made her wishes plain in 3 separate letters this month alone. The match will secure the estate's finances, and secure them quickly, which is more than can be said for anything else at present." Elara, seated quietly at the end of the long table where she had taken to sharing simple meals with the staff rather than dining alone in the cold East Wing, felt something small and unfamiliar tighten in her chest at the mention of a wedding. She told herself firmly that it was none of her concern. Julian Ashcombe's marriage, however it came about, was a matter entirely separate from her own quiet life among the roses and the stitched hands and the mended hems. She had no claim on him, and wanted none, she reminded herself, though the reminder felt oddly necessary. We had best get the good linens aired, Mrs. Pemberton said briskly, rising from her seat as though the matter were already settled and there was nothing to be gained by further discussion. And the silver polished. Whatever we think of the lady, this house will not be found wanting when she arrives. The preparations that followed consumed the household for days. Curtains were beaten free of dust, floors scrubbed until they gleamed, the good china counted and recounted to be certain nothing was chipped or missing. Alara found herself drawn into the effort despite having no obligation to help, mending torn drapery in the formal drawing room late into the evening simply because Mrs. Pemberton had mentioned, almost offhandedly, that there was no one else with a steady enough hand to do it properly before the guests arrived. It was during one of these long evenings, needle in hand beneath the drawing room's tall windows, that she encountered Julian for the second time since her arrival. He entered without expecting anyone to be there, a glass of brandy in one hand and a look of distracted exhaustion on his face, and stopped abruptly at the sight of her seated by the window with a length of pale gold curtain across her lap. "You are still awake," he said, as though it were an accusation. "The curtains will not mend themselves, my lord." She did not look up from her work. "And I understand you have important guests arriving soon." Something in her tone made him study her more closely. "You have heard, then?" "The whole house has heard. I imagine the horses in the stable have heard by now as well." She allowed herself the smallest note of dry humor, and was surprised to see, for just a moment, the corner of his mouth twitch, as though he might almost smile. He did not smile. He crossed instead to the window nearest her, looking out at the darkened garden below, the one she had spent weeks restoring with her own 2 hands. "You did that," he said. It was not quite a question. "Peter did most of it," she said honestly. "I only pointed out where the roses still had life in them, beneath the dead wood. He knew the rest." Julian was quiet for a long moment, his reflection ghostly in the dark glass. "My mother planted that garden the year she married my father. She used to say a person could tell everything about a household by the state of its garden, whether it was loved or merely maintained." His voice had gone strangely quiet. "I let it die because I did not know how to look at it without thinking of her." Alara set her needle down carefully, sensing that he had not meant to say quite so much, and that any wrong word now might close the door he had just, however briefly, allowed to open. "Gardens do not truly die, my lord," she said gently, echoing words Peter had once spoken to her. "They only wait for someone patient enough to remember what they wanted to be." For a moment, something passed between them that neither of them fully understood. A recognition, perhaps, of 2 people who had each learned to survive loss by building careful walls around the softest parts of themselves. Then Julian seemed to catch himself, straightening, his expression closing over once more like a door quietly shut. "See that the curtains are finished by week's end," he said, his voice returning to its usual clipped formality, and he left the room without another word. Alara sat alone in the quiet drawing room long after he had gone, her needle still, her thoughts anything but. She told herself again that his marriage was none of her concern, but some quiet, stubborn part of her no longer quite believed it. Lady Vivian Ashford arrived at Ashcombe Hall in a carriage far grander than the house itself, and within 10 minutes of stepping through its doors, she had already found 3 things to criticize. "The drive wants gravel," she announced to no one in particular, drawing off her gloves finger by finger, as Edmund bowed low beside the entrance. "And that fountain in the east garden is an eyesore. Whoever allowed roses to grow so wild ought to be dismissed." Lady Constance, a tall woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, swept in behind her, already surveying the entrance hall with the air of someone conducting an inspection rather than paying a family visit. "Julian," she said, greeting her nephew with a brisk kiss to the cheek that seemed to carry more obligation than affection. "You look thin. Have you been eating properly, or has this house fallen into as much disorder as your letters suggest?" "The house is well managed, Aunt," Julian said, his jaw tight in the way Alara, watching from the shadowed edge of the gallery where she had no real business standing, had come to recognize as his particular brand of controlled patience. "You will find nothing wanting in your stay." "We shall see." Lady Constance's gaze swept past him, over Edmund, over the assembled staff lined up to greet the new arrivals, and finally landed, with a flicker of something unreadable, on Alara herself, standing slightly apart in her plain gray dress. "And who is this?" "A distant relation," Julian said, his tone carefully neutral. "Miss Whitmore. She has been staying in the East Wing." "Whitmore?" Lady Constance repeated the name as though testing its worth on her tongue. "I do not recall any Whitmores among the family connections." "She is not family in any sense that concerns you, Aunt." The words were clipped, final, and Alara felt them land somewhere unexpectedly tender, though she told herself firmly that she had no right to expect anything different. She was, after all, exactly what he had said, a distant relation, nothing more. Vivian, however, had not stopped studying her. Her pale eyes moved slowly over Ilara's plain dress, her work-roughened hands, the faint smudge of garden soil still visible beneath one fingernail despite her best efforts to scrub it away, and something like satisfaction settled over her sharp, pretty features. "How charming," Vivian said, in a voice that made the words sound like an insult. "A poor relation kept about for charity's sake. How very generous of you, my lord." Ilara said nothing. She had learned, over the years, that silence was often the safest answer to cruelty dressed up as compliment, and she excused herself from the hall as soon as she reasonably could, retreating toward the kitchens where Margaret took one look at her face and pressed a cup of hot tea into her hands without a word of explanation needed. "That one," Margaret said grimly, nodding toward the direction of the entrance hall, "has not changed a hair since her last visit. Meanest tongue this side of the county, and a smile sweet enough to hide it from anyone fool enough not to look closely." "She did nothing wrong," Ilara said quietly. "She only spoke the truth. I am a poor relation, kept here out of obligation." "You are a great deal more than that," Mrs. Pemberton said, entering the kitchen in time to catch the last of the exchange, her expression stern. "And I will not have you speaking of yourself the way that woman speaks of you. Now drink your tea. You have earned a moment's peace before the real work of hosting begins." The days that followed tested the patience of the entire household. Lady Vivian found fault with everything from the temperature of her bathwater to the arrangement of flowers on the dining table, each complaint delivered with a bright, brittle smile that made refusal impossible and correction exhausting. Lady Constance, for her part, occupied herself largely with steering every conversation toward the subject of the wedding, pressing Julian for dates, for details, for assurances that the match would be finalized before the year's end. "The estate cannot continue bleeding money the way it has," she told him one evening in the study, her voice carrying clearly through the door Ilara had not meant to overhear as she passed with an armful of freshly laundered linens. "Vivian's dowry alone would settle every debt your father left behind. You cannot afford sentiment, Julian. You never could. I am aware of the estate's difficulties, Aunt. You need not remind me of them daily. I remind you because you seem determined to forget them. I have seen the way you look at that garden lately. I have seen the way half the household speaks of that Whitmore girl, as though she hung the moon." Lady Constance's voice sharpened. "Whatever foolishness has taken root in this house since her arrival, I suggest you pull it up by the stem before it costs you everything your father worked for." Ilara did not linger to hear more. She continued down the corridor with her heart beating faster than the errand warranted, telling herself firmly that Lady Constance's words meant nothing, that whatever she imagined she had glimpsed in Julian during their quiet conversation over the curtains had been nothing more than a lonely man's momentary weakness, quickly regretted and already forgotten. It was 3 days later. During a small gathering Lady Constance had arranged to introduce Vivian to the neighboring families, that matters came to a head. Ilara had not been meant to attend. She understood her place well enough to know that a poor relation banished to the East Wing had no business mingling with lords and ladies over afternoon tea, and she had planned to spend the hours in the garden instead, finishing work on a trellis Peter had helped her build for the roses to climb once spring arrived. But Mrs. Pemberton had asked her to deliver a fresh pot of tea to the drawing room when one of the younger maids fell ill, and it was in performing this small, ordinary task that she found herself standing in the doorway of the drawing room at precisely the moment Vivian decided to make her point to the assembled guests. "You must forgive the state of the East Garden," Vivian was saying to a cluster of interested neighbors, her voice carrying easily across the room. "Lord Ashcombe keeps rather unusual company these days. A distant cousin, or perhaps not even that, has taken it upon herself to play at gardening, among other things. I understand she fancies herself quite useful about the house, stitching wounds, mending linens, tending roses. One almost wonders whether my lord intends to marry his housekeeper instead of his intended bride." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the small crowd. Ilara stood frozen in the doorway, the tea tray heavy and trembling slightly in her hands, acutely aware of every eye that had turned toward her, drawn by Vivian's pointed gaze. "Ah," Vivian said, her smile widening with cruel delight at having caught her target so perfectly. "Speak of the housekeeper, and she appears." "Do come in, Miss Whitmore. We were only just discussing your many talents." Ilara felt heat rise to her face, humiliation and anger tangling together in her chest, but she forced herself to set the tea tray down on the nearest table with steady hands, refusing to let the tremble reach her voice when she spoke. "I am glad to have been of use to the household, my lady. I do not consider it beneath me to help where help is needed." "How very noble," Vivienne said, though the word dripped with contempt. "Though I do wonder whether Lord Ashcombe finds it quite so noble to have a servant's daughter playing lady of the house while his true bride sits by, ignored." The room had gone very quiet. Ilara opened her mouth to offer some measured reply, some way of retreating from the room with what little dignity remained to her, but before she could speak, another voice cut across the silence, cold and absolutely final. "That is enough, Vivienne." Julian stood in the doorway behind her, having arrived, it seemed, at the precise moment his intended bride had chosen to humiliate a woman under his own roof. His face was pale with a fury Ilara had not seen in him before, not even in that first cold moment of her arrival. "Miss Whitmore is a guest in this house," he continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the drawing room, "and she has done more for this household in a matter of weeks than most who have called themselves family have managed in years. I will not have her spoken of in such a manner beneath my own roof." Vivienne's smile faltered, her pale eyes widening with a flash of genuine shock, before hardening once more into something colder. "Julian, surely you do not mean to embarrass me in front of half the county over a servant's feelings?"
"I mean,"
he said, "to make certain no guest of mine is ever spoken to that way again." The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. Lady Constance's face had gone the color of old parchment, torn between outrage and the sudden dawning realization that her carefully arranged match might be unraveling in front of an audience of the very neighbors whose good opinion she had hoped to secure. The other guests exchanged glances, murmuring quietly behind gloved hands, already composing the version of this story they would carry home to their own drawing rooms by evening. Ilara, for her part, could not quite breathe. She had expected many things from Julian Ashcombe since her arrival at his house. Coldness, indifference, at best, a grudging tolerance of her presence in his home. She had not expected him to defend her, publicly, in front of the very woman his family had chosen for him to marry. "My lord," she managed finally, her voice quieter than the room, "you need not trouble yourself on my account. I am quite accustomed to managing on my own." "I know you are," Julian said, and something in the way he looked at her, steady and unflinching despite the roomful of witnesses, made her chest ache in a way she did not have words for yet. "That is precisely the trouble." He turned back to his aunt and his intended bride, his expression settling once more into the cool, controlled mask he wore so often, though Ilara had seen now, unmistakably, what lay beneath it. "I believe tea is finished," he said, and the gathering ended shortly after, guests departing in a flurry of whispered speculation, leaving behind a silence in the great house that felt, to Ilara at least, like the quiet before a much larger storm. That night, Mrs. Pemberton found her in the kitchen long after the rest of the household had retired, staring into a cup of tea gone cold hours before. "You have upended this house rather thoroughly, miss," the housekeeper said, though there was no real disapproval in her voice, only something that looked almost like satisfaction. "In 6 short weeks, I do not think Ashcombe Hall has seen this much excitement in a decade." "I did not mean to cause trouble," Ilara said. "I only wish to be useful." "I know." Mrs. Pemberton sat down across from her, folding her weathered hands on the table between them. "But sometimes, my dear, the most useful thing a person can do in a house like this one is remind everybody in it what it feels like to be seen. You have done that for every servant under this roof. Do not be so surprised that it has done the same for its master." Ilara said nothing, but long after the housekeeper had bid her good night and retired to her own quarters, she sat alone in the quiet kitchen, turning over Julian's words in her mind, wondering, with a mixture of hope and fear she had not felt in years, exactly what storm was coming, and whether the fragile new roots she had planted in this house, in the garden, in the hearts of its servants, and perhaps, however impossibly, in its master, would survive it. She was not the only one awake to consider the evening's events. Down the corridor, in the grand guest chamber usually reserved for visiting dignitaries, Lady Constance paced before a dying fire, while Vivienne sat rigid in a chair by the window, her earlier composure entirely abandoned. "He humiliated me," Vivienne said, her voice tight with a fury she had not permitted herself to show in front of the guests. "In front of every family of consequence in the county, over a servant." "She is not a servant," Lady Constance said sharply, though her tone carried more worry than correction. "That is precisely the difficulty. If she were merely a servant, this would have ended the moment he sent her to the East Wing. Servants know their place. Whatever that girl is, she does not. Then remove her." Vivienne rose from her chair, her pale eyes glittering in the firelight. Send her away before the wedding. I will not share this house with a woman my future husband looks at the way he looked at her tonight. Lady Constance said nothing for a long moment, staring into the flames as though searching them for some solution that had not yet presented itself. It is not so simple, she admitted finally. The girl has made herself useful to every soul in this household, from the cook to the stable boy. Dismiss her without cause, and you will find the entire staff turned against you before the wedding cake is even ordered. Servants talk, Vivienne. They talk to other servants, in other great houses, and a bride's reputation can be made or unmade in a kitchen quite as easily as in a ballroom. Then what would you have me do, smile and thank her for embarrassing me? I would have you be patient, Lady Constance said, her voice hardening into something colder and more calculating. Julian is stubborn, but he is not foolish. He knows what this marriage means for the estate, whatever soft feelings may have taken root in his chest this past month. Let him have his moment of sentiment. It will not survive contact with his ledgers for long. In the meantime, we shall find a quieter way to remind Miss Whitmore precisely where she stands in this house. The following morning, Ilara woke to find a folded note slipped beneath her door, written in a careful, elegant hand she did not recognize. It requested her presence in the small parlor at the rear of the house, at an hour when she knew the rest of the household would be occupied elsewhere. She went, curious rather than wary, and found Lady Constance waiting for her alone, seated very straight in a high-backed chair, a cup of tea untouched on the table beside her. Miss Whitmore, please, sit. Ilara did, though something in the older woman's carefully composed expression made her cautious. I will speak plainly, Lady Constance began, because I suspect you are not a woman who appreciates being managed with pretty words. You have made yourself indispensable to this household in a remarkably short time. I do not doubt your intentions were good ones. Thank you, my lady. But you must understand the position you have placed my nephew in. Lady Constance's voice remained even, almost gentle, which made it somehow more unsettling than open hostility would have been. This estate is drowning in debt left behind by his late father. The roof of the West Tower has not been repaired in 3 years for want of funds. Half the tenant farms have gone without proper investment. Julian's marriage to Lady Vivienne is not a matter of sentiment. It is a matter of survival, for this house, and for every soul who depends upon it, from the cook in the kitchen to the boy who mends the stables. If that marriage fails to take place, I promise you, it will not be the family who suffers most. It will be them. Ilara felt the weight of the words settle over her like a stone. I have no wish to stand between his lordship and his duty. And yet you already do, whether you intended it or not. Lady Constance leaned forward slightly. I am not asking you to leave this house, Miss Whitmore, though I suspect that would be the simpler solution for everyone involved. I am asking you to consider, carefully, what your continued presence here is costing the people you claim to care so much about. A servant's loyalty is a fine thing. It does not pay for a new roof. She rose then, smoothing her skirts, and paused at the door. Think on it. That is all I ask. Ilara sat alone in the small parlor for a long while after Lady Constance had gone, the older woman's words circling in her mind with a cruel, undeniable logic. She thought of Margaret in the kitchen, of Mrs. Pemberton's tired hands, of Peter's careful, healing fingers, of every soul in this house who had welcomed her when its master had not, and who now, however unknowingly, stood to lose everything if her presence truly threatened the one match that could save the estate from ruin. By that evening, she had made her decision. She found Mrs. Pemberton in the linen room, sorting through a stack of newly mended sheets, and told her, as steadily as she could manage, that she intended to write to a distant acquaintance of her late mother's in the north, a widow who had once offered her a position as governess to her children, and that she thought it best to leave Ashcombe Hall before the wedding preparations began in earnest. Mrs. Pemberton set down the sheet in her hands very slowly. And why, precisely, would you do that? Because I do not wish to be the reason this house loses everything it needs to survive, Ilara said. Lady Constance is right. This marriage matters more than my comfort here. Lady Constance, Mrs. Pemberton said, her voice suddenly sharp in a way Ilara had never heard from her before, has been managing this family's affairs for 30 years, and has never once, in all that time, considered the comfort of anyone who was not born to a title. You will forgive me if I do not take her concern for this household's welfare entirely at face value. She crossed the room and took Ilara firmly by the shoulders. You listen to me, miss. This staff did not welcome you because we pitied you. We welcomed you because you treated us like people, for the first time in longer than I care to remember. If you leave this house now, on that woman's word alone, you will be doing exactly what she wants, and precious little else. But the debts are real, Mrs. Pemberton acknowledged, but they are not yours to solve by disappearing quietly into the night like something ashamed of itself. Whatever happens between his lordship and that family, it will happen because of what he chooses, not because you slipped away before anyone had the chance to fight for you. She softened, just slightly. Give it time, Ilara. Do not let her frighten you out the door before the story has finished telling itself. Ilara did not send the letter that night, but she did not entirely set aside the fear Lady Constance had planted in her either, and it followed her into an uneasy sleep, the first she had known since her arrival at Ashcombe Hall. The letter to the widow in the north sat unfinished on Ilara's small writing desk for 3 days, before she finally admitted to herself that she could not bring herself to complete it. It was Peter who found her staring at the blank second page one gray afternoon, her pen dry, her thoughts clearly 1,000 miles from the garden work waiting outside. You look like a woman deciding whether to jump into cold water, he observed, setting down the basket of cut roses he had carried in for her to arrange. You look like a woman deciding whether to leave, she admitted, before she could stop herself. Peter's face fell in a way that told her, more clearly than any argument Mrs. Pemberton could have made, exactly how much her presence had come to matter in this house. Leave? Why would you leave? You only just got the trellis built. The roses will not climb it properly without someone here to train the branches. Peter, you cannot leave, he said, with the blunt certainty of youth. Who will stitch up my hand next time I am fool enough to reach where I should not? Who will remember which of the tenant children are afraid of the dark and needs a candle left burning, or which of the kitchen maids cannot read her own letters and needs someone patient enough to teach her without laughing? You have made yourself part of this house, miss. You cannot simply write yourself out of it because some fine lady told you to. Ilara set down her pen, startled by the boy's fierce conviction. How did you know about the letter? Mrs. Pemberton is not half so quiet about her worries as she thinks she is, Peter said, with a small, knowing smile. She has been fretting over it for 2 days. Ilara said nothing, but she did not pick the pen back up that afternoon, nor the one after. It was Julian, in the end, who found the letter, though not by any deliberate search. He had come to the East Wing himself for the first time since her arrival, drawn by a matter concerning the estate's finances that he had, almost without realizing it, begun to consult her about more and more frequently over the preceding weeks. She had, it turned out, a quick and careful mind for numbers, sharpened by years of managing her late mother's meager household accounts, and more than once he had found her observations on his ledgers sharper and more useful than those of the estate's own steward. He knocked, and receiving no answer, let himself in, when Mrs. Pemberton, passing in the corridor, assured him Ilara had only just stepped out to the garden and would return shortly. It was there, on the small writing desk by the window, that he saw the unfinished letter, its opening lines plainly visible. I write to inquire whether the position of governess to your children remains available. Circumstances have arisen that make it necessary for me to seek employment elsewhere, and at the earliest opportunity. He read no further before Ilara returned, breathless from the cold, her arms full of the last roses of the season, and found him standing over her desk with an expression she could not immediately read. You are leaving, he said. It was not a question. Ilara set down the roses carefully, buying herself a moment to compose an answer. I have not decided anything final, my lord. You have written to secure another position. His voice had gone very quiet, the way it did, she had learned, when he was working hard to keep some stronger feeling in check. Why? She could have lied. She could have offered some vague excuse about wishing to be independent, about not wanting to impose on his hospitality indefinitely. Instead, exhausted by weeks of careful diplomacy, she found herself telling him the truth. Your aunt came to me, she said. She explained, quite reasonably, that this estate cannot survive without your marriage to Lady Vivian, and that my presence here complicates that marriage in ways that could cost every soul in this household their livelihood. I did not think it fair to let my own comfort stand in the way of that, whatever I might wish otherwise. Something flickered across Julian's face, quick and sharp, gone before she could fully name it. My aunt had no right to say such a thing to you. She had every right, my lord. She only spoke the truth. She spoke a version of the truth that suited her purposes, Julian said, his voice rising with an intensity Ilara had rarely heard from him. This estate's debts are real. I will not pretend otherwise, but they existed long before you arrived, and they will not vanish the moment you leave. My aunt would have you believe your absence is the price of this family's survival, when in truth, it is only the price of her own comfort and Vivian's pride. Ilara stood very still, hardly daring to breathe as he crossed the small room to stand before her, closer than he had ever stood before. "I have spent this past month," he said, more quietly now, "trying very hard to convince myself that what I feel when I watch you in that garden, or across the dinner table, or bent over my ledgers finding errors my own steward missed, is nothing more than gratitude for the changes you have brought to this house. I have failed rather spectacularly at convincing myself of any such thing." Alara's heart was beating so loudly she was certain he must hear it. "My lord, Julian," he corrected softly, "if we are to have this conversation honestly, you might at least use my name." "Julian," she said, and the name felt strange and wonderful on her tongue. "You are promised to another. Whatever you feel, or believe you feel, changes nothing about the arrangement your aunt has made for you." "An arrangement I have not yet signed my name to," he said, "and one I find myself, with each passing day, less and less willing to honor. The debts will have to be solved another way," he said firmly. "I refuse to purchase this estate's survival with a marriage built on nothing but ledgers and obligation. Not when—" He stopped himself, visibly, drawing back as though he had nearly said something he was not yet ready to voice aloud. "Not when—" "What?" Alara asked, unable to help herself. Julian studied her for a long moment, something raw and unguarded moving behind his eyes. "Not when I have finally begun to understand what my mother meant, all those years ago, about a garden showing you the true state of a household. This house was dying long before you arrived, Alara. Slowly, quietly, the way things die when no one is paying proper attention. You did not simply restore a garden, you restored something in every person under this roof that I had thought lost for good, myself included." Alara did not trust herself to speak. Instead, she reached out, almost without thinking, and took his hand, the way she might have taken the hand of anyone in pain who needed steadying. He did not pull away. "I have not signed the letter," she said finally. "Perhaps I will not send it at all." "Perhaps," Julian said, something like hope breaking through the careful control he usually wore like armor. "You might consider staying for reasons that have nothing to do with anyone's aunt, or anyone's debts, and everything to do with what you might want for yourself." The moment stretched between them, fragile and unfamiliar, until the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside sent them both stepping quickly apart, the ordinary business of the house intruding once more on something neither of them was yet ready to name aloud. But the letter to the widow in the north was never finished, and never sent, and though neither of them spoke of the conversation again for several days, something had shifted between them that neither Lady Constance's careful warnings nor Vivian's sharp tongue would prove able to fully undo. That evening, Alara found herself unable to settle to any task. She wandered down to the kitchen, where Margaret was still awake kneading dough for the next morning's bread, and sat at the long table, without quite meaning to say anything at all. "You have the look of a woman with a great deal on her mind," Margaret said, not looking up from her work. "Is it that obvious?" "To anyone with eyes, miss." Margaret set the dough aside to rest beneath a cloth and wiped her floury hands on her apron. "I have watched this house change these past weeks, same as everyone else. Watched his lordship start taking his walks at the same hour every evening, always past that garden. Watched him ask after you at dinner when he thinks nobody is paying attention. I am an old woman who has spent 30 years in kitchens, miss. I know the look of a man falling in love long before he is willing to admit it to himself." Alara felt her cheeks warm. "It cannot come to anything, Margaret. He is promised to Lady Vivian. Whatever either of us might wish, that will not simply vanish because of a conversation in a small room." "Wishes rarely vanish for want of being inconvenient," Margaret said with a small, knowing smile. "They have a way of making themselves known regardless. All I will say is this. This house has been happier these past weeks than I have seen it in a decade, and every soul under this roof, from the stable to the scullery, knows exactly why. Whatever comes of it, do not let fear of a title convince you that you do not deserve what you have already earned." Alara carried those words with her up to her small room that night, turning them over alongside everything Julian had said to her in the quiet of the East Wing. She did not know what the coming weeks would bring, whether his resolve would survive the pressure his aunt was certain to bring against it, or whether Vivian would simply retreat quietly once she understood the marriage no longer held his full commitment. But for the first time since her arrival at Ashcombe Hall, she allowed herself to hope for something more than mere survival within its walls. Vivian, however, was not a woman inclined to accept defeat quietly, and it was not long before she began to notice the change in Julian's manner toward the quiet young woman she had once dismissed as beneath her notice. She noticed the way his eyes followed Alara across a room he had once entered, without so much as glancing at anyone in it. She noticed the new gentleness in his voice when he spoke to her, so different from the clipped formality he still reserved for everyone else, herself included. And noticing it, she began, quietly and carefully, to plan. She began by watching. For 3 days she said nothing, offered no complaint, made no scene, content instead to observe the small, unguarded moments that passed between Julian and Alara when neither of them believed themselves seen. The lingering glance across the dinner table, the way he found reasons, increasingly transparent to anyone paying close attention, to seek her out over matters that could easily have waited, or been handled by his steward entirely. The way Alara's careful composure softened, just slightly, whenever he entered a room. By the 4th day, Vivian had seen enough to be certain of what she faced, and had begun, with the same cold precision she brought to every challenge in her life, to consider exactly how best to remove it. She found her opportunity sooner than expected. Passing the small parlor late one afternoon, she overheard Julian's voice through the half-open door, speaking not to Alara, but to his steward, discussing changes to a tenant lease that Alara had apparently suggested weeks earlier, changes that had already begun to ease the burden on several of the estate's struggling farming families. Miss Whitmore's suggestion regarding the Hartwell lease has proven sound, Julian was saying. See that the same terms are extended to the Cobb family as well. I want every tenant on this estate treated with the same fairness she recommended. Vivian stood frozen in the corridor, listening as the man she was meant to marry credited a penniless relation with reshaping the management of his entire estate, speaking her name with a warmth she had never once heard him use for anyone, least of all for her. It confirmed everything she had begun to suspect, and hardened, in that moment, into something far more dangerous than jealousy. It hardened into resolve. She did not confront Julian that evening, nor the one after. Instead, she wrote a careful letter to her own mother in London, and began, quietly, to gather what small pieces of information she could about Miss Alara Whitmore's past, certain that a woman with so little fortune, and so little family, must have something in her history worth uncovering, something that might prove far more useful to her cause than any public scene ever could. The letter arrived from London 10 days later, and Vivian read it twice through before allowing herself a small, satisfied smile. It was not, in truth, the discovery she had hoped for. There was no scandal buried in Alara Whitmore's past, no hidden disgrace waiting to be exposed before the assembled families of the county. Her mother had died of a long illness 2 years prior, leaving debts of her own behind, and Alara had spent the years before that nursing her alone in a small rented house on the edge of a market town, with no fortune, no connections, and no prospects beyond the charity of a cousin she had never met. It was, if anything, a story more likely to earn sympathy than suspicion. But Vivian had learned long ago that the truth mattered a great deal less than what people were willing to believe, particularly when it was delivered with enough conviction and just enough plausible detail to seem credible. She began that same evening, seated across from Lady Constance in the older woman's private sitting room, laying out her plan with the same careful precision she might have used to arrange a difficult seating chart. She nursed her mother through a long illness, Vivian said, alone, for years, with no assistance and precious little money. A woman placed in such circumstances, desperate and without prospects, might do a great many things to secure her own future that she would rather not have known. You intend to suggest impropriety, Lady Constance said slowly, studying her future niece with an expression that was not entirely approving. I intend to suggest nothing at all, Vivian said sweetly. I intend only to mention, quite innocently, in the right company, that Miss Whitmore's own mother left this world under circumstances that were never fully explained, and that a young woman raised in such reduced conditions might have learned certain skills of persuasion that serve her rather too well in a house full of vulnerable, lonely servants, and a grieving lord in need of comfort. I need not accuse her of anything at all. I need only plant the seed, and let the county's imagination do the rest. Lady Constance was quiet for a long moment. It is a cruel plan. It is a necessary one, Vivian said, her sweetness vanishing entirely. Unless you would prefer to explain to your family why this estate's salvation dissolved for the sake of a gardener's daughter, with a talent for mending torn hems. Whatever reservations Lady Constance still harbored, they did not stop her from remaining silent, as Vivian set her plan into motion over the following days, dropping careful, poisonous suggestions into conversation with the wives of neighboring gentlemen who had attended the earlier gathering, each remark phrased with such apparent reluctance and concern that it seemed almost an act of charity to voice it at all. Word traveled quickly through households of consequence, the way it always did, and within a week, whispers had begun to reach even the servants of Ashcombe Hall, carried home by tradesmen and delivery boys who had heard the gossip repeated in kitchens across the county. By the time it reached Mrs. Pemberton's ears, the story had grown considerably in the telling, twisted into something far uglier than Vivian's original careful suggestion, as such stories always did. "They are saying," Mrs. Pemberton told Alara grimly, having called her into the housekeeper's private parlor to deliver the news directly, rather than let her hear it second-hand from some careless maid, "that your mother's death was not entirely what it seemed, that you have a history of ingratiating yourself with vulnerable households for personal gain. It is filth, every word of it, but filth has a way of sticking regardless of the truth beneath it." Alara sat very still, her hands folded tightly in her lap, feeling the ground shift beneath her in a way she had not experienced since the day she had watched her mother draw her final breath. "My mother died of a fever that no physician in 3 counties could cure, Mrs. Pemberton. I sat beside her every night for the better part of a year. I would never—" "I know that," Mrs. Pemberton said firmly, reaching across the table to take her hand. "Every soul in this house knows that, but I fear the story has already spread beyond the walls where the truth might reach it in time." The following days tested Alara more severely than anything she had yet endured at Ashcombe Hall. Where once the neighboring gentry had greeted her with polite, if distant courtesy during the rare occasions she was seen about the grounds, they now regarded her with open suspicion, whispering behind gloved hands whenever she passed, drawing their daughters a little closer as though her very presence might prove contagious. A tradesman's wife, delivering fabric for the household's mending, refused outright to hand the parcel to Alara directly, insisting instead that it be given to Mrs. Pemberton, as though Alara's touch alone might somehow taint the goods. Julian, when he learned of it, was consumed by a fury Alara had never witnessed in him before, cold and absolute, directed entirely at the source of the rumor rather than at her. "I know precisely where this began," he told her, finding her in the garden one gray afternoon, her hands trembling too badly to continue the pruning she had been attempting. "Vivian's mother has written to half the county this fortnight. I have seen the pattern of it in every conversation I have overheard since the story first surfaced." "It does not matter where it began," Alara said quietly, staring at the roses she had spent weeks coaxing back to life. "It only matters that it has taken root, and that I cannot prove it false to people who have already decided to believe it." "You do not need to prove anything to strangers who have never troubled themselves to know you," Julian said fiercely. "But you will not face this alone, whatever they choose to believe." He was true to his word in the days that followed, defending her openly wherever the rumor reared its head, but his defense alone was not enough to silence a story that had already spread far beyond his direct influence, and Alara began to notice, with a familiar ache of dread, that even some among the household staff had grown quieter around her, uncertain what to believe amid so much conflicting talk. It was Margaret who finally decided the whispering had gone on long enough. She gathered the entire staff in the servants' hall one evening, standing at the head of the long table with her arms crossed, and an expression that dared anyone present to contradict her. "I have heard enough foolishness passed round this kitchen this week to fill a book nobody would wish to read," she announced. "So I will say this once, plainly, and I expect it to be the end of the matter. I have known Alara Whitmore for 2 months now, and in that time, I have watched her stitch a boy's hand in the dark without a moment's hesitation, mend a maid's failing eyesight worth of sewing, without ever once asking for thanks, and treat every soul in this house, from the lowest scullery girl to his own lordship, with the exact same respect. A woman who behaves that way toward people who can do nothing for her in return is not a schemer, whatever fine ladies with nothing better to occupy their time might choose to whisper." A murmur of agreement moved through the assembled staff. Mrs. Pemberton stepped forward beside Margaret, her expression equally resolute. "I have served this family for 30 years, she said, "and I have never once, in all that time, seen this household so well cared for as it has been these past 2 months. Whatever story Lady Vivian's family has chosen to spread through the county, it will not be repeated within these walls. Anyone who carries that filth further, from this house to another, will answer to me directly." Peter, standing near the back of the room, his stitched hand fully healed now, spoke up with the fierce loyalty of youth. "She is the only person in this whole county who ever treated me like I was worth something more than a pair of hands for mucking out stables. I do not care what any fine lady says about her. It is a lie, and everyone standing in this room knows it." Edmund, ever formal and rarely given to open displays of sentiment, cleared his throat and added his own quiet weight to the growing chorus. "Miss Whitmore's conduct in this house has been entirely above reproach, in every particular. I would be glad to say as much to anyone who asks me directly, whatever their standing in the county." Alara, who had entered the servants' hall unnoticed partway through Margaret's speech, stood frozen in the doorway, overwhelmed by a wave of gratitude too large to easily contain. She had come to Ashcombe Hall expecting nothing, prepared for isolation and cold obligation, and instead she had found, in the most unlikely corner of a grand house that had never truly wanted her, an entire family willing to stand against a lie for her sake. News of the servants' unwavering loyalty reached the neighboring households within days, carried, ironically, by the very network of gossip that had first spread Vivian's poisonous suggestion. But this time, the story that traveled was a different one entirely, a story of a household united in defense of a woman they had all, in their own quiet ways, come to love, and it did more to undo the damage of Vivian's rumor than any direct denial from Julian ever could have managed alone. Lady Constance, hearing of the servants' open rebellion against her carefully orchestrated scheme, summoned Vivian to her private parlor with an expression that suggested her patience, considerable as it was, had finally reached its limit. "You have made us both look foolish," she said, without preamble. "An entire household standing united against a rumor you engineered, and half the county now murmuring about your cruelty rather than her supposed impropriety. This was meant to remove an obstacle, Vivian, not hand her the very sympathy that will make her impossible to remove at all." "It is not finished," Vivian said, though for the first time since her arrival at Ashcombe Hall, a note of genuine uncertainty had crept into her voice. "Julian has not yet broken the engagement. Whatever the servants believe, the contract remains unsigned but not yet dissolved. I still have time." "Time for what, precisely?" Lady Constance's voice was cold. "I begin to wonder whether your determination to win this match has less to do with love for my nephew, and rather more to do with your unwillingness to be the first among your circle to suffer a broken engagement. Do not mistake my support for endless patience, Vivian. If you cannot secure this marriage through honest means, I will not continue defending methods that have already cost us the goodwill of an entire household, and increasingly, of the county besides." That same night, Julian sought Ilara out in the small parlor where she had taken to sitting after supper, a book unopened in her lap, her thoughts too tangled to focus on any page. "You heard what they said tonight," he said, closing the door softly behind him. "In the servants' hall." "I did." Her voice caught slightly. "I did not expect it. I did not think I had earned so much loyalty in so short a time." "You earned it the moment you stitched Peter's hand instead of asking whether it was your place to do so," Julian said, crossing the room to sit beside her. "You earned it every time you chose kindness over convenience, in a house that gave you very little reason to extend either." He was quiet a moment, studying her face in the low firelight. "I owe you an apology, Ilara. My aunt's scheming, Vivian's cruelty, all of it has touched you because of a house you were sent to against your own wishes, banished to a wing nobody thought worth heeding properly. You have borne all of it with more grace than I have managed in a lifetime of privilege." "You have nothing to apologize for," Ilara said softly. "None of this began with you." "Perhaps not," he said, "but I intend to end it. I have delayed too long already, hoping some easier path might present itself, some way to satisfy my aunt's demands without breaking a promise I never truly wished to make. There is no easier path. There never was." "Julian," she said his name carefully, aware of how much weight it now carried between them. "Whatever you decide, do not let it be decided out of anger at Vivian's cruelty. This is your future, your estate, your family's legacy. I would not have you throw any of it away simply to spite the woman who wronged me. I am not deciding out of anger," he said, taking her hand in both of his own. "I am deciding because I have finally understood what my mother meant about gardens showing the true state of a household. This house was withering long before you came, Ilara, choked by debt and grief and my own stubborn refusal to feel anything at all, rather than risk feeling the wrong things. You did not simply prune back some roses. You showed every soul in this house, myself included, what it looked like to be tended with genuine care rather than mere obligation. I will not repay that by marrying a woman who tried to poison an entire county against you for daring to be kind to people she considered beneath her notice." Ilara felt tears gather, unbidden, at the corners of her eyes, though whether from relief or fear of what still lay ahead, she could not entirely say. "Your aunt will not accept this easily." "No," Julian agreed, "she will not. But I have spent a great deal of my life doing what was expected of me rather than what I believed to be right, and I find I am no longer willing to continue in that manner, whatever it costs." He did not press her further that evening, content simply to sit beside her by the fire until the hour grew late, but the conversation settled something between them that neither Lady Constance's warnings nor Vivian's schemes would prove strong enough to unravel in the days that followed. The confrontation Julian had promised came sooner than either of them expected. 2 mornings later, Lady Constance summoned him to the study, her manner colder and more formal than he had seen since his father's funeral. "I understand you have been making rather bold declarations in the servants' quarters," she said, without preamble, defending that girl's honor to the very staff who ought to know their place well enough not to require such reassurance. "I have been defending the truth," Julian said evenly, "against a rumor your future daughter deliberately manufactured to destroy an innocent woman's reputation. I make no apology for it." "And what, precisely, do you intend to do about your engagement?" Lady Constance's voice sharpened. "The contracts are all but finalized. Vivian's dowry has already been discussed with your creditors as security against the estate's most pressing debts. If you break this engagement now, Julian, you will not simply disappoint a family of consequence. You will very likely lose this house entirely, and every soul who depends upon it for their livelihood along with it." It was the same argument she had used before, the same threat that had once been enough to keep him silent and compliant for months, and for a long moment, Julian felt its familiar weight settle over him once more. "Then I will find another way to save this house," he said finally, "one that does not require me to build my family's future on a foundation of cruelty. I will not marry Vivian, aunt, whatever it costs." Lady Constance's face went pale with a fury she did not trouble herself to hide. "You are a fool, Julian. A sentimental fool. Throwing away this family's last chance at security for the sake of a penniless relation with nothing to offer this house but a talent for mending torn linens." "She has offered this house a great deal more than that," Julian said quietly, "and I suspect, in time, you will come to see it too. But even if you never do, my decision remains the same." He left the study before his aunt could offer any further argument, though the weight of what he had just declared settled over him fully only once he was alone in the corridor outside, uncertain whether he had just saved his family's future or thrown it away entirely. It was, though neither woman fully realized it in the moment, the beginning of the end of their alliance, and within Ashcombe Hall itself, Elara found herself, for the first time since her arrival, entirely certain of exactly where she belonged. Vivian received the news of the broken engagement not from Julian himself, but from her own mother, who arrived at Ashcombe Hall 2 days later in a state of barely contained outrage, having heard the story secondhand from Lady Constance's own hurried letter. "You are to be humiliated before the entire county," her mother said, pacing the length of the guest chamber while Vivian sat rigid and silent by the window. "Jilted, for a penniless relation with no fortune and no name worth speaking. I will not have it. I will not have my daughter's name dragged through every drawing room from here to London as the woman a lord abandoned." "It was never going to be a love match," Vivian said finally, her voice unusually quiet. "We both knew that from the beginning. I wanted the title. He wanted the dowry. I do not know why I expected either of us to pretend it was anything more. Sentiment has no place in an arrangement of this kind," her mother said sharply. "And yet here we are, undone by precisely that. You must go to him. Appeal to his sense of honor, if nothing else. A man does not simply abandon a contracted engagement without consequence." Vivian was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the garden below, where she could see, even from this distance, the figure of Elara kneeling among the roses, utterly unbothered by the storm that had gathered around her these past weeks. There was something in the sight that finally broke through the last of Vivian's careful composure, not jealousy exactly, but something closer to exhausted recognition. "I do not think I wish to appeal to anything," she said quietly. "I have spent this entire visit trying to destroy a woman who never once returned my cruelty with anything but quiet dignity, and it has won me nothing but the contempt of an entire household and the loss of the very match I fought so hard to secure. I am tired, Mother. I would rather go home and begin again somewhere I am not remembered for this, than continue fighting a battle I have already lost." Her mother stared at her, clearly unprepared for such an admission, but something in Vivian's exhausted certainty left little room for further argument, and within the week, mother and daughter departed Ashcombe Hall together, their carriage rattling down the same drive Vivian had once complained wanted gravel, leaving behind a silence that felt, to the household staff who watched it go, remarkably like relief. In the days immediately following Vivian's departure, the household seemed to breathe more easily than it had in months. Meals were taken with genuine laughter rather than careful, watchful silence. Margaret's kitchen filled once more with the comfortable chaos of ordinary life, free from the constant demand for perfection that Vivian's presence had imposed upon it. Peter took to whistling as he worked in the stables, a habit he had abandoned entirely during the tense weeks of the engagement, and even the horses, he claimed, seemed less skittish now that the house itself had settled into calmer waters. Elara found herself, for the first time since her arrival, able to walk the halls of Ashcombe Hall without the constant, wearying awareness of being watched and judged by eyes that wished her elsewhere. She spent her mornings in the garden as always, but her afternoons increasingly found her in the study alongside Julian, poring over accounts and correspondence with a freedom that would have seemed impossible only weeks before. Lady Constance remained a few days longer, her manner cooler than it had ever been, clearly still processing the collapse of a plan she had spent months carefully constructing. It was Mrs. Pemberton of all people who finally found the older woman standing alone in the east garden one gray afternoon, staring at the roses with an unreadable expression. She built all of this herself, Mrs. Pemberton said, coming to stand beside her uninvited. Nobody asked her to. Nobody paid her to. She simply saw something dying and could not walk past it without trying to help. I am aware of the girl's talents, Mrs. Pemberton, Lady Constance said, though without her usual sharpness. I have heard little else from every member of this household for the better part of 2 months. Then perhaps, Mrs. Pemberton said carefully, it is worth asking yourself why an entire staff, myself included, came to love her so quickly, when we have served this family faithfully for decades, without ever once feeling moved to defend any of you quite so fiercely. Lady Constance did not answer immediately, but something in her expression, standing there among roses that had been coaxed back from near ruin by patient, careful hands, seemed to soften by some small, grudging degree. I acted as I believed necessary for this family's survival, she said finally. I do not know that I was entirely wrong to fear what this estate's future might look like without Vivian's dowry to secure it. No, Mrs. Pemberton agreed. But fear rarely makes for good counsel, my lady. Sometimes the thing that saves a household is not the largest fortune available to it, but the smallest, most stubborn kind of care, tended patiently enough, for long enough, that it finally takes root. Lady Constance left Ashcombe Hall the following morning, her farewell to Julian formal but notably less severe than her earlier warnings had suggested it might be, and though she made no promises about her future support, she did pause, on her way to the waiting carriage, to offer Elara a single, measured nod, the closest thing to approval the proud old woman seemed capable of extending. With the immediate crisis past, Julian turned his full attention to the estate's finances, and it was here that Elara's quiet contributions over the preceding weeks finally revealed their true value. The tenant lease reforms she had suggested, modest as they seemed, had already begun improving yields across several of the estate's struggling farms, and her careful review of the household ledgers uncovered years of small inefficiencies and outright mismanagement by a steward who had grown comfortable assuming nobody would trouble to check his figures too closely. You have found more savings in these accounts in a fortnight, Julian told her one evening, spreading the corrected ledgers across his study desk, than my father's steward managed to find in a decade of supposedly careful management. I begin to think this estate's salvation was never going to come from a dowry at all. It will not solve everything, Elara cautioned, though she could not entirely suppress the pride in her own voice. The debts remain significant, but careful management, and a little patience, may accomplish more than anyone expected. Patience, Julian said, setting down his pen and studying her across the desk, seems to be something you have taught this entire household a great deal about, myself included. Over the following weeks, the estate's fortunes began, slowly but unmistakably, to improve. New leases brought steadier income from the tenant farms. Corrected accounts revealed funds that had been quietly misallocated for years, enough, once recovered, to begin long overdue repairs to the West Tower roof that had troubled the household for so long. Julian, freed from the weight of an unwanted engagement, and increasingly confident in decisions he now made with Elara's counsel close at hand, found himself, for the first time since his father's death, genuinely hopeful about the future of the house he had inherited. It was on a bright morning in early spring, the garden finally beginning to show the full promise of the careful work Elara and Peter had invested in it through the long cold months, that Julian found her once more among the roses, this time not merely to discuss estate matters, but for reasons that had nothing at all to do with ledgers. I have spoken with my aunt, he said, coming to stand beside her at the newly repaired fountain, which had, at last, begun to run with clear water once more. She has withdrawn her objections, reluctantly, and with a great many conditions attached regarding proper courtship and appropriate timelines, but withdrawn nonetheless. Elara straightened, brushing dirt from her hands, her heart suddenly beating very fast. Objections to what, precisely? To this, Julian said, and reached into his coat to produce a small velvet box, his usual careful composure entirely abandoned in favor of something far more vulnerable. I am aware that I have very little to offer you beyond a house still recovering from years of debt, and a family that did not welcome you kindly at first. I am aware that you came to this house with nothing, and that I very nearly sent you away entirely on your first day here, a decision I will regret for the rest of my life. But I have watched you transform every corner of this house and every heart within it, including my own, and I find I cannot imagine any future for Ashcombe Hall that does not include you at its very center. Elara stared at the box, then at him, tears gathering in her eyes despite her every effort to hold them back. You banished me to the East Wing, she said, half laughing, half weeping, on the very morning I arrived. I did, Julian admitted, and it remains the single greatest mistake of my life, and simultaneously, the reason I ever came to know you at all, since it was there, in that neglected corner of my own home, that you began quietly saving everything I had let fall into ruin, myself included. He opened the box to reveal a simple, elegant ring. Marry me, Elara, not for the estate's survival, and not for any obligation to anyone but ourselves. Marry me, because I love you, more than I believed myself capable of loving anyone, and because this house has never once, in all the years I have lived in it, felt more like a home than it has since you arrived within its walls. Elara did not trust her voice enough to answer in words. Instead, she nodded, and Julian, with a laugh of pure relief and joy that the household staff would later swear they had never once heard from him before, slipped the ring onto her finger and drew her into his arms, right there among the roses she had brought back to life with nothing but patient, stubborn care. News of the engagement spread through Ashcombe Hall within the hour, carried by a jubilant Peter who could not contain himself long enough to let anyone else deliver the news first. Margaret wept openly into her apron. Mrs. Pemberton, usually so composed, allowed herself a rare, wide smile as she embraced Elara in the kitchen doorway. Even Edmund, stern as ever, offered a formal but unmistakably warm bow of congratulation, declaring, with as much emotion as the old butler ever permitted himself, that it was the finest news the household had received in a decade. The months between the engagement and the wedding passed more quickly than Elara had ever expected. There was much to prepare, and yet none of it felt like the anxious, obligatory bustle she had witnessed during the preparations for Vivienne's visit. Mrs. Pemberton oversaw the arrangements with obvious joy rather than duty, consulting Elara on every decision as though she were already the true mistress of the house, which, in every way that mattered to the household staff, she already was. Margaret spent weeks testing recipes for the wedding feast, insisting that nothing less than perfection would do for the occasion, while Peter took it upon himself to ensure that every rose in the garden would be in full, glorious bloom by the appointed day, tending them with a devotion that made Elara's throat tighten with gratitude whenever she watched him at work. Julian, for his part, seemed a different man entirely from the cold, distracted lord who had ordered her banished to the East Wing on her very first morning at Ashcombe Hall. He laughed more easily. He sought her out not from obligation or necessity but simply for the pleasure of her company, and the household staff, who had watched him grow increasingly withdrawn in the years since his father's death, marveled quietly among themselves at how thoroughly he had been transformed by a woman none of them had expected to matter at all. The wedding, when it came that summer, was a modest affair by the standards of families like the Ashcombes, held not in some grand cathedral in London, but in the very garden Elara had restored with her own hands, beneath an arbor of climbing roses trained carefully up the trellis Peter had built for her that first autumn. The entire household staff attended, not as servants required to observe from a respectful distance, but as honored guests, seated among the very few members of the county gentry who had remained loyal to the family throughout the difficult months of gossip and scandal. Lady Constance attended as well, her manner still formal but genuinely warm for the first time since Elara had known her, and she pressed a small, carefully wrapped gift into Elara's hands before the ceremony began, a set of fine embroidery needles that had once belonged to Julian's mother. She would have liked you very much, Lady Constance said simply. She always did have a soft spot for anyone with the patience to tend something properly, whatever the cost. I am glad, in the end, that I was wrong about you, Elara. I do not say that easily, but I say it honestly. Elara, standing in the garden she had once been banished to as an unwanted guest, surrounded now by every soul who had come to matter most to her in this once cold and neglected house, could not have imagined, on that first frightened morning when Julian had ordered her things carried to the East Wing, that she would one day stand in this very spot as its true and beloved mistress. But standing there, hand in hand with the man who had once looked at her with nothing but cold obligation, and now looked at her with nothing but love, surrounded by a household that had claimed her as their own long before its master had found the courage to do the same, she understood, finally, the truth Peter had spoken to her all those months before. tending roses that everyone else had given up for dead. Nothing that is truly loved is ever entirely lost. It only waits, patiently, for someone willing to remember what it was always meant to become. And in the end, it was not a fortune, or a title, or a carefully arranged marriage that had saved Ashcombe Hall from ruin. It was the quiet, stubborn kindness of a woman once banished to its farthest, coldest corner, who had, without ever intending to, won every single heart within its walls, beginning with the one that mattered most. Winter returned to Ashcombe Hall a year after Alara's wedding, but it was a different house from the one she had first entered as a frightened, uncertain guest, carrying nothing but a single trunk and a letter of introduction nobody had truly wanted to honor. The East Wing, once cold and forgotten, had been fully restored over the course of the year, its rooms opened, its fireplaces repaired, its long-neglected corridors filled once more with warmth and light. Julian had insisted on the renovation himself, unable to look upon the wing that had once housed his new wife in such careless exile, without wanting to make amends for it in some lasting way. Alara had protested at first that the expense was unnecessary, that she had grown rather fond of her old chamber despite its early hardships, but she had relented eventually, understanding that the gesture meant as much to Julian as it did to the house itself. It was in that same restored East Wing, on a bright, cold morning in early winter, that the household staff gathered once more, this time not out of loyalty to defend Alara against cruel rumor, but to celebrate the arrival of the estate's newest and smallest member. The birth had been difficult, longer and harder than the physician had expected, and Julian had paced the length of the corridor outside for the better part of a night, refusing every attempt by Edmund or Mrs. Pemberton to draw him away to rest, until finally, near dawn, the thin, insistent cry of a newborn child had broken the anxious silence of the house. "A daughter, my lord," the physician announced, emerging at last with a tired but satisfied smile. "Strong lungs, and a fine, healthy color to her. Your wife is resting comfortably." Julian did not remember crossing the room to her bedside, only that he found himself there, kneeling beside Alara, who lay exhausted but radiant, a small bundle held carefully against her chest. "She has your eyes," Alara said softly, looking up at him with a tenderness that still, after a year of marriage, occasionally caught him entirely by surprise. "I was rather hoping she would. And your stubbornness, I suspect," Julian said, smiling down at the tiny, wrinkled face peering up at him with evident displeasure at the brightness of the world she had just entered. "She has already made her opinions known rather loudly this morning." They named her Margaret Rose, after the cook who had championed Alara's cause when the household first began to whisper about the strange new guest in the East Wing, and after the garden that had brought Alara and Julian together in the first place. Margaret herself wept openly upon hearing the news, declaring, between happy sobs, that she had never in all her years of service been so honored, and insisted on personally overseeing every meal prepared for the new mother during her recovery, refusing to let anyone else near the kitchen for the better part of a fortnight. Peter, now grown taller and steadier in his duties as head groom, a position Julian had granted him the previous spring in recognition of years of loyal, careful work, was among the first allowed to visit the nursery, and he stood at the edge of the small crib for a long while, studying the sleeping infant with an expression of fierce, protective tenderness that reminded Alara powerfully of the boy who had once insisted she could not possibly leave Ashcombe Hall over some fine lady's cruel words. "She will grow up loving this garden the way you do," he said finally. "I will make certain of it." "I do not doubt you for a moment," Alara said, smiling at him with the same warmth she had shown him on that very first cold morning, when he had found her pruning roses nobody else believed worth saving. The estate itself had continued its steady recovery through the year, its finances no longer a source of constant worry, its tenant farms flourishing under the fair terms Alara had first suggested, and Julian had continued to expand across every corner of the property. The west tower roof, repaired at last, no longer leaked during the autumn storms, and the household accounts, carefully managed under Alara's watchful eye, showed a surplus for the first time in over a decade. Lady Constance visited twice that year, her manner warming a little further with each visit, until by the time of little Margaret Rose's birth, she arrived at Ashcombe Hall not as a stern inspector determined to protect the family's interests from an unsuitable match, but as a doting great-aunt bearing gifts of fine lace and quietly murmured advice about the raising of children, advice Alara accepted with far more grace than she might once have believed herself capable of extending to the woman who had once tried so hard to send her away. "I was wrong about you," Lady Constance admitted one afternoon, watching from the nursery doorway as Alara rocked her daughter gently by the window overlooking the garden below. Not simply about your character, though I was certainly wrong about that as well, but about what this family truly needed to survive. I spent so many years believing that only fortune and careful arrangement could secure a house like this one against ruin. I did not understand, until I watched you transform Ashcombe Hall from the inside out, that the truest kind of security comes from the people a house chooses to love, and to be loved by in return. You could not have known, Elara said gently. You were only trying to protect the family you loved, in the only way you had ever been taught to protect it. Perhaps, Lady Constance said, but I am glad, every single day now, that Julian was stubborn enough to ignore my advice when it mattered most. Of Vivienne, little was heard in the years that followed, save the occasional piece of distant news carried through the wider circles of London society. She had, it was said, married eventually, a widowed gentleman of modest but respectable fortune, who valued her sharp wit far more than he valued any grand title she might have once hoped to claim through marriage to Julian. Whether she found true happiness in that arrangement, Elara never learned for certain, though she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she harbored no lingering bitterness toward the woman who had once tried so hard to destroy her reputation. Whatever cruelty Vivienne had shown during those difficult weeks, it had, in its own strange way, only strengthened the bonds between Elara and the household that had chosen to stand beside her, and for that, at least, she found she could extend a measure of quiet, distant forgiveness. The garden, meanwhile, had grown more beautiful with each passing season, its roses climbing ever higher along the trellis Peter had built with his own careful hands, its fountain running clear and constant, its paths worn smooth by the frequent footsteps of a household that had come to treasure it as much as Elara herself. On warm summer evenings, Julian and Elara often took their daughter there together, walking slowly among the roses as the sun set gold and soft over Ashcombe Hall, the same garden that had once been left to die in quiet neglect, now standing as living proof of everything patient, stubborn kindness could accomplish, given time enough, and someone willing to tend it. Mrs. Pemberton, growing older now but no less sharp in her observations, liked to remind anyone who would listen that she had known, from that very first morning when Elara arrived with nothing but a single trunk and a letter nobody wished to honor, that the girl banished so carelessly to the East Wing would one day become the very heart of the house that had tried, however briefly, to cast her aside. I told you, she was fond of saying to Margaret over their evening tea, watching through the kitchen window as Elara walked the garden paths with her small daughter held close against her shoulder, Julian's arm wrapped warmly around them both. Forgotten places have a way of becoming exactly where the most important things begin to grow. There were quieter moments, too, in those first years, moments that never reached the notice of the wider county, but that meant a great deal more to the household itself. There was the evening Edmund, ever formal in his duties, quietly taught little Margaret Rose to say her first proper greeting to guests, delivered with such solemn seriousness that the entire dining room dissolved into helpless laughter. There was the afternoon Julian, still learning the patience that gardening required, ruined an entire row of Elara's carefully tended seedlings attempting to help with the planting, and accepted her gentle teasing about it with far more grace than the old guarded lord who had once banished her to the East Wing would ever have managed. There was the winter storm that knocked out half the estate's fences, and the entire household, family and staff alike, working side by side through the cold to repair them before nightfall, nobody once questioning whether such labor was beneath their station. It was these small, unremarkable moments, more than any grand declaration or dramatic rescue, that Elara came to treasure most as the true measure of the life she had built at Ashcombe Hall. She had arrived expecting isolation, and had found instead an entire family willing to claim her as their own, long before its master had found the courage to do the same. She had been sent to a forgotten corner of a grand house, and had discovered there, quite by accident, that forgotten corners were often exactly where the most important things began to grow, given enough patience and enough genuine care. Peter married a few years later, a quiet, capable young woman from a neighboring farm who shared his gentle way with animals and his easy laugh, and Julian and Elara stood among the guests at the small country wedding, with as much pride as if they had been celebrating a member of their own family, which, in every way that mattered to them both, they were. Margaret Rose grew quickly, as children do, and by her 4th year had already claimed the garden as entirely her own domain, following Peter through the rows of roses with the same fierce curiosity her mother had once brought to that same neglected ground, demanding to know the name of every plant, every bloom, every small green thing pushing up through the soil each spring. Elara often stood at the nursery window watching her daughter at play among the roses, thinking of the frightened, proud young woman who had first stepped down from a carriage into a house that did not want her, and marveling at how completely that story had transformed itself into this one. And in the golden evening light of Ashcombe Hall, surrounded by the family and household she had won not through fortune or title, but through nothing more than quiet, patient care, Elara understood, at last and completely, that her old friend had been entirely right.